From the studios of the Optimism Institute, welcome to Blue Sky, where we share stories and insights to remind us that there is always blue sky above. Sometimes you just have to get your head above the clouds to see it. I'm your host, Bill Burke. At the Optimism Institute, we've always believed that there's much to be gained by spending time in the outdoors, off screens, and immersed in nature. Our guest today is someone who agrees and has spent much of his career studying and teaching about this very subject. Dr. Marc Berman is the world's leading environmental neuroscientist, founder and director of the Environmental Neuroscience Laboratory at the University of Chicago, and co-author of the terrific book, Nature and the Mind, the science of how nature improves cognitive, physical, and social well-being. Marc is the winner of the Association for Psychological Science Early Career Research Award and the American Psychological Association Early Career Award. He's professor and chair of the Department of Psychology at the University of Chicago, as well as co-director of the Masters of Computational Social Science program. His work has been featured on CNN, NPR, and in many popular publications, including The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, Vice, Newsweek, National Geographic, and USA Today. I hope you enjoy this blue sky conversation with Dr. Marc Berman as much as I did. Marc Berman, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast.
Thank you for having me on the program.
I loved your book, Nature and the Mind, the science of how nature improves cognitive, physical, and social well-being. And I want to start with how you coined the term environmental neuroscience, but that's not where your career started. Could you explain how your interest sort of moved into the field that you study now?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a long story. I won't tell it all here, but I started off in engineering as an undergraduate, particularly in computer engineering. My dad's a lawyer. He said, don't become a lawyer. My mom's a nurse. She said, don't go in the medical profession. They said, all the engineers we know are happy and you're good at math and science. You should go into engineering. So I went into engineering, but it wasn't the best fit for me. I wasn't really interested in making computers faster. I was kind of interested in human behavior, but I kind of thought psychology to me at that time was only clinical psychology, and I'm not sure I wanted to do that. But in my undergraduate years, I did take this biomedical engineering seminar by this professor, Doug Knoll, and he worked on functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is this technology where you can actually see people's brains while they're doing different tasks. And I just thought, that's like the most interesting thing I've ever heard of. I have to do that. And so I reached out to Professor Knoll, and he said, come work in my lab. And I started working in his lab, but from an engineering side. So I was putting phantoms in the MRI scanner, which were basically sort of like bowls of gelatin with wires going in them. And I was sending current into these phantoms and putting them in the MRI machine and seeing if I could recover the signals that I was putting into these phantoms. And that was interesting, but I saw all of these psychologists going into the MRI suite too, and they were running experiments on people. And I thought, that looks really interesting. And so Doug could see that I was really interested in that. So he said, I'm going to set you up with a meeting with the other co-director of the MRI center, which was John Janitas, a really famous cognitive neuroscientist. And I started talking with John, and 5 minutes into the conversation, John says to me, Marc, you're not an engineer, you're a psychologist. Why don't you come work in my lab? And so I started working in John's lab and working on MRI technology and how we can brain image people's brains and see what's going on in their heads when they're doing different tasks.
Incredible. And early in your book, you talk about how much of human history, we saw this sharp disconnect between the brain and the body. We thought that, and going back to Descartes and others, I think it was, who said, they're two separate things. And increasingly science moved those two together. So it seems to me then it's an outgrowth of actually looking at the physical brain when our body is experiencing things. Does that help tie these things together?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, our thoughts are the product of a biological system of our brains. All of our feelings, all of our emotions, all of our thoughts, they're coming from our brain, and different bodily sensations, can affect our mind. When you're anxious, when you're hungry, those things can all affect cognition. So mind and body are one thing.
So I believe you started getting interested in this connection and how nature can impact our brains and our bodies from your mentors, Stephen and Rachel Kaplan, when you were at Michigan. And they came up with something called attention restoration theory, or ART. If I'm accurate, can you explain that and how they influenced you?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was in graduate school, I saw this flyer for this class that Steve Kaplan was teaching called Neural Models of Learning, and it looked really interesting. And I hadn't heard of Steve Kaplan before, but I decided to take that class, and it was life-changing for me. And in that class, Steve talked about a lot of different things. But one of the things he talked about was attention, and in particular, directed attention. And that directed attention is like this human resource or mental energy that's required to do a lot of things that, maybe at the beginning of the day, you're really able to focus and pay attention to certain things. And towards the end of the day, you're not able to. And so Steve and his wife, Rachel, they came up with this theory called attention restoration theory that basically posits that humans have two kinds of attention. So one kind of attention, again, called directed attention, is the kind of attention where you as an individual person are deciding what to pay attention to. So presumably, listeners to this podcast are deciding to pay attention to what we're talking about, even though they might be able to pay attention, they might find other things that are more interesting in the environment than what we're talking about. And it's thought that we can only direct our attention for so long before we become mentally fatigued and it's hard to focus anymore. And we've all had that sensation at the end of a long workday. We might be kind of just staring at our computer screen, really hard to focus. I see that when I'm lecturing, the first 5 minutes of lecture, everybody's got their eyes on me. 45 minutes into lecture, people are kind of nodding back. It's just hard. It's just hard to keep people's attention. That's a little bit different from involuntary attention, which is the kind of attention that's automatically captured by interesting stimulation in the environment. So bright lights, loud noises, those kinds of stimuli automatically capture our attention, and we don't really have control over it. And it's thought that that kind of attention is less susceptible to fatigue or depletion. So you don't often hear people say, oh, I can't look at that beautiful waterfall anymore. It's just so interesting. It's tiring me out. I have to look away. Or, oh, I can't watch this really interesting movie anymore. It's just so interesting. I'm getting so tired out. I have to shut it off. So the idea is with attention restoration theory is that if we can find environments that don't place a lot of demands on directed attention, so they don't have a lot of things where we have to really focus hard on, while simultaneously having interesting stimulation to capture our involuntary attention, maybe we could sort of restore or replenish this precious directed attention resource. And we think a lot of natural environments meet this criteria of not placing a lot of demands on directed attention while simultaneously having interesting stimulation to capture the involuntary attention. And there's one other point that I think is important to mention too, which is that Steve and Rachel and now me, we think it's important that the kind of stimulation that captures your involuntary attention be what we call softly fascinating and not harshly fascinating. So what do I mean by that? When you look at that beautiful waterfall, it captures your attention, but it doesn't do so in an all-consuming way. You can still kind of mind wander or think about other things while looking at that beautiful waterfall. If you're in Times Square in Manhattan, that's also super interesting. Lots of stimulation to capture your involuntary attention, but it kind of does so in a very harsh or all-consuming way. It's very hard to sort of mind wander or think about anything else when you're in Times Square. So we think it's important that the kind of stimulation that activates the involuntary attention should be softly fascinating and not harshly fascinating. And we believe that a lot of the stimulation that we find in nature is sort of softly fascinating, water, flowing, the swaying of branches in a tree, a bubbling brook, waves crashing into the beach. Those kinds of stimulation are interesting, but they're not sort of all-consuming. They're softly fascinating.
It was interesting to hear how Marc Berman's engineering background eventually led him to a fascination with functional MRIs, which led to an interest in the workings of the human brain. From this beginning, his work has moved into studying what different stimuli and conditions do to our brains and how they impact our attention. And he's shown through his research that it's softly fascinating stimuli, not the electronic bombardment of Times Square or cell phones, that help give us energy and increase our ability to pay attention. I think you describe in the book how we use the expression pay attention. We only have so much attention. You pay it out of a cache of attention, right? And it seems, and this is going to an obvious place for a lot of listeners, that there's Times Square, there's the external, lit up boards, and then there are these devices that we carry around that are pinging us, and it's so hard to ignore the buzz in your pocket or the ping of the text. And so your work is that much more timely, I would think, as these devices roll out the way they have. So can you talk about those stimuli that we invite in by our screens and our bright lights and all that sort of thing?
Yeah, and I think many people might have the intuition that, surfing the web or scrolling your social media feed or streaming something on Netflix is sort of a passive, relaxing activity. But we actually think it isn't, that it's a depleting activity, that it is sort of harshly fascinating. And, one thing that, Steve used to mention to me was, if something is an addiction, it's usually not good. and these devices, they were designed or invented for many different reasons, but now they're kind of becoming attention grabbing machines to kind of grab your attention and not let it go, because they want to show you advertising, basically. And they want to keep your eyeballs on the device. And that's what we would say is harshly fascinating. And, anecdotally, a lot of people report feeling kind of more mentally fatigued after spending a lot of time on their devices. So it's not only that being on these devices is neutral, it may actually be further depleting. And again, I'm not anti-technology, but I think we have to be mindful and we have to be careful. And I think, a lot of people are talking about this. I mean, Jonathan Haidt has wrote this book, The Anxious Generation, that, social media is causing kids to be more anxious and maybe causing all of us to be more anxious. And I think what I'm trying to add to this is that these devices, these technologies may be further depleting us, that we're actually going to have less of this attentional resource. We're paying it out and they're just less saved in the bank account. But what's really interesting is that we think interacting with nature can kind of replenish the bank account, that after you interact with nature, you may be able to direct your attention better. And I think that's very promising. So, a lot of people would say, okay, get off of your devices, but then what are you supposed to do? And I think what I'm suggesting is go out and interact with nature. That's a good way to restore your attention bank account.
I think back when you talk about the exhaustion of being on screens, and so many books will be written at some point about what we all experienced during the pandemic. But I think about, I was on some boards at the time, and we'd have, 25 people in meetings, and an in-person meeting pre-pandemic, they could get a little boring or exhausting, whatever. But there was nothing more exhausting than Zoom fatigue. And, so what was that? What was the difference? Well, you might be looking at how you look. You might be, you're not getting that real world interaction. And what a lot of us craved during the pandemic, and this is a good bridge to where we're going, was to get outside. It's like, oh, can I just turn that off and just go for a walk? And so does that all make sense to you? Because I remember people just being like, why am I so tired? All I've been doing is sitting, looking at in this passive meeting on Zoom. Well, it wasn't natural. It didn't you were paying too much attention in an exhausting way. Does that sound right?
Yeah, absolutely. Being on Zoom, there's some positives to Zoom, but it does seem like it's more, it fatigues directed attention a bit more than a real face-to-face interaction. It just requires more directed attention. And yeah, I think in the pandemic, particularly, when we didn't really understand the virus so well, a lot of cities closed parks, or they didn't want people to go into spaces because they didn't want people interacting with each other. But that really harmed people. We need to be able to go out into nature to potentially get this cognitive restoration. So, and then other cool things happen where, some cities, because there wasn't as much car traffic, they could actually close down streets so that you could kind of walk in more places in the city, and that was also beneficial. And I think that's also kind of related. Car traffic also, is fatiguing of directed attention. And, when we actually tested, does walking in nature actually lead to these benefits, we contrast that to walking in a more urban environment that has all the distractions of an urban environment.
Okay, so let's dive into, because you're not just speculating about this. You have done some fascinating research, and for me at least, one of my takeaways was a hallmark study was the walk in the park studies that you've done. Can you describe what those are and what you learned from them?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I met Steve Kaplan and I heard about this attention restoration theory, it was just really fascinating to me, because a lot of people in psychology and neuroscience, when they talked about sort of improving people's attention or their ability to focus, they talked primarily about things like some kind of pharmacological intervention, like taking some kind of drug, or maybe doing some difficult cognitive training kind of regimen to increase people's ability to attend. But Steve was mentioning something that many fewer people were talking about, which is that interacting with different environments can change your attention. I just thought that was a really fascinating idea. And so I wanted to test it. And there had been some tests, but a lot of the research was more subjective. So, they would say, okay, Bill, go on this walk of nature and then tell us afterwards, how do you feel? Do you feel like your attention is better? And a lot of people would say, yes, I feel like my attention is better, but, did your attention really improve? So Steve and my other advisor, John Janitas, and we designed a way to test attention restoration theory, but doing it with objective measures. So what we did is we brought participants to the laboratory, and then we gave them difficult attention tasks, like this one kind of task that's called the backwards digit span task, where participants would hear digits out loud, like 8, 3, 7, and the digits were at a pace of 1 digit per second. And the participants needed to repeat them back in backwards order. So 7, 3, 8. And at 3 digits is not so difficult, but we keep increasing the number of digits up to about 9 digits. At around 5 digits, it's a very challenging task. So we give you this difficult backwards digit span task, and then we gave participants a map to go for a walk in nature to the Ann Arbor Arboretum, or through a walk on a busy urban environment through a busy Washtenaw Street in downtown Ann Arbor. And then participants came back to the lab, and they did that backwards digit span task again. But we also did another thing. Before participants went on their walk, we did 2 things. The first thing we did is we had them wear a GPS watch so that we could track them, so that we knew they didn't just go to Starbucks, that they actually went on the walk, or they weren't cheating.
Yep. Trust but verify.
That's right. And then we also took participants' cell phones. And the reason we did, we didn't want them to be chit-chatting or texting while on the walk. We wanted their mind, their attention to be captured by the stimulation in the environment. So participants come to the lab, they take that backwards digit span task, they go for the walk in nature or the walk in the urban environment. They come back to the lab after their walk, they take that backwards digit span task again. Then they come back to the lab a week later and they repeat the whole procedure again. So if they walked in the natural environment the first week, they walk in the urban environment the second week. So everybody did both walks. So everybody was their own control. We had about 40 people do the study, participate in the study, and we found that after the walk in nature, participants improved on this backward digispan task by about 20%.
20% better than they did pre-walk.
That's right.
Okay. And the urban?
Yeah. Urban environment, not much improvement. Maybe a little bit of improvement. And people might be thinking, well, this is just because nature is nice and people just like nice things. They feel better. And that's why they're showing these improvements. And participants did like the nature walk more. But we also took mood measurements to measure their mood before the walk and after the walk. And we didn't find a strong correlation between improvements in mood and improvements on this backwards digispan test. So it didn't seem like participants that had the biggest improvement in the mood were the ones that were showing the biggest improvement on this backwards digispan task. But an even stronger demonstration that we didn't think this was all about liking or mood changes was that we had participants walk at different times of the year. So some of our participants did our study in June when it was like 80 degrees Fahrenheit in Ann Arbor. People loved the walk. They said, Mark, I can't believe you're paying me to go for a walk in nature. Healthy mood effects, healthy backwards digispan effects. But we also had other participants walk in January when it was like 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Participants did not like that walk in the winter time. They said, Mark, I was cold out there. I did not enjoy that walk. But the participants that walked in January showed the same backwards digispan improvements as the people that walked in June. So you didn't have to enjoy or like the nature walk to get these benefits. And I think that's really important because that's a bit counterintuitive. I think a lot of people think, well, nature is pleasant and that's where you're getting benefits, but it seems like something deeper is going on. It's not just about pleasantness or some kind of hedonic response. There's something about being in the natural environment, how it captures our involuntary attention that's producing these benefits.
Incredible. The walk in the park studies that Dr. Berman describes here are fascinating. A key point I took away was that we benefit not just from being outside, but rather being specifically in nature. A walk in a wooded park provides great benefits, even in the depths of a cold winter, while time outdoors in an urban environment don't have the same impact. Getting back to our conversation, I wanted to dig a little more into Marc's research and resulting findings. You took away their cell phones, and I'm assuming if you take the natural setting in Ann Arbor, but you walking through it staring at a screen, now you're closer to Times Square, right? I mean, now it's more, and so honestly,
Bill, I think you could be like you're anywhere. I mean, people aren't going to notice anything on the phone,
right? So I'm talking to you from New York, and it's sort of like you could walk down, pick a busy street in New York, or you could walk in the heart of Central Park. Yet I'll see people walking in the heart of Central Park on their phones. I just think, oh, you're so close. Yeah. Or sitting on a park bench on their phone. It's like you could be anywhere. So the lesson is outside probably maybe marginally better than inside, but really it's the setting outside that seems to make the big difference.
And the mindset, if you're distracting yourself from the nature, I don't think you're going to get those benefits. And people ask me, well, what about, listening to a podcast or listening to music? And, I would say, try it without that, because you really want all of your attention to be captured by the interesting stimulation in the environment. And as an aside, sometimes I kind of joke with my students. I ask them, how many of you like to study for the exam in a coffee shop or listening to music? And all of the class raises their hand. And then I say, okay, how many of you want to take the exam in a coffee shop or listening to music? And everybody says, nobody raises their hand. I said, well, what's going on here? That's a paradox. And the reason for that paradox is that studying is not pleasant. It's not fun. So you're trying to do something to make it more enjoyable, or seeing that other people are doing it to share the pain, that it's not fun. But when you take that exam, you want all of your directed attention on that exam. You don't want to be distracted. So in an ideal world, you would study in quiet, just like you would take the exam. And so just the opposite is happening when people have their earbuds in or they're on the phone in nature. They're using directed attention. They're not allowing involuntary attention to be captured by that stimulation. They're blocking, basically nature's ability to restore. So I tell people, take the earbuds out. Don't go with a friend. This is for you. You want it to be a solitary, quiet experience where you can just let your mind be captured by the stimulation of nature.
It's fantastic. I love the example of would you take the test there. I also wonder too, Marc, if I've heard people talk too about how we've almost removed quote unquote boredom from our lives. That the minute we feel slightly bored, you grab a phone, you do that. And I feel like when you allow yourself to be what some might say is bored, that's actually when some of your best thinking happens. So for example, I like to exercise. I will not exercise with AirPods and I got a problem, go for a run, come back, problem solved. Right? Is that something that you've studied too, that we just can't allow our minds the space to sort of expand and think? Or for example, taking a shower. People say, oh, get great ideas in the shower. Well, why is that? Well, maybe it's the nature and the water and all that. Maybe it's because you're not thinking about anything else. Long, not even really a question, but have you studied that?
Yeah. And I have two thoughts about that. So the first one, and this was an observation that Steve had, and he always had great observations. When I was in grad school, iPods were really popular, and it was so interesting. When you'd walk around campus, you would see everybody with their iPod and their earbuds in. They weren't wireless, but they were wired. I remember being with Steve one time, and he mentioned to me, Mark, look at everybody so uncomfortable with their own thoughts. And it just really stuck with me that, yeah, you're right, Steve. It's like constantly distracting yourself. You can't handle just being alone with your thoughts on a walk to class. The people are just so uncomfortable with that. And there were some interesting studies that were done by some social psychologists like Tim Wilson and Dan Gilbert, where they gave students the option to sit in a dark room for 15 minutes alone, or they could give themselves an electric shock. And most people chose the electric shock because being alone with your thoughts was so either boring or painful. People just did not want to do that. So I think you're hitting on something that, yes, definitely humans now have a very difficult time being bored and are very uncomfortable being bored. So one thing that's kind of interesting is that we think actually being in nature allows you to feel more comfortable being bored and more comfortable with your own thoughts. And, you said, something when you go for a run, you can solve a problem. You can look up, there are so many anecdotes of scientists, CEOs, different kind of creative people. They have a problem, they can't solve it. They go for a walk in nature, and then boom, all of a sudden they solve the problem. And part of that is because our brains are never off. The brain is constantly working. And sometimes I think our consciousness can kind of interfere with the brain's work. And, going in nature, again, it's kind of shutting down this directed attention and just having this involuntary attention, which can be very, very refreshing. And that's another reason too, why you don't want to go in nature with the AirPods in or the phone. You want to allow for that quiet in the brain. And related to this, we did a study with participants with depression, and John had a big NIH grant at the time to study depression. And we were kind of wondering, if you're a person suffering from depression, maybe a walk alone in nature is going to make you feel worse. You're going to be ruminating, and it's just going to allow you more time to kind of, wallow in your sorrows. So we basically performed that same walk in a park study, but this time with participants who had been diagnosed with clinical depression. And before they went on the walk, we had them think about a negative thought or memory that was bothering them. And then we sent them on the walk. And I know it sounds kind of cruel, but it was really interesting, the results. The results were actually much stronger for these participants with clinical depression, meaning that their directed attention improved more compared to the non-clinical sample. And it wasn't the case when you ask people, what were you thinking about on the walk? It wasn't like on the urban walk, they were thinking about the problems, and on the nature walk, they weren't. In both environments, they were thinking about the problems. But we think that, when you have depression, that sucks up a lot of cognitive resources. Your bank of directed attention is drained. But if you can go out in nature and restore your bank of directed attention, that can really help you to deal with the things that are bothering you. And it turned out to be really, really beneficial for these participants with depression. And now doctors in Canada and in the UK are actually prescribing walks in nature for people who are suffering from depression and anxiety. I don't think we can say yet that walks in nature replace, pharmacological interventions for depression or anxiety, or talk therapy, but certainly walking in nature, we believe, can be a supplement to those treatments for depression and anxiety.
That's so great. It's funny you use the example of when iPods first came out, because now I was just reading how iPods are coming back, and it's with young people who are trying to take the screens away. So it's like this retreat. And by the way, fun fact, you might stump your students with this because I don't think young people know this. The word podcast comes from iPods. It was a broadcast on a iPod. That's where the name podcast comes from. You can stump people with that. I may have even stumped you. Because the early days of podcasting, that's really the only, you would literally download it into your iPod as opposed to streaming. Anyway, fun fact. Once again, Dr. Berman emphasizes here that it's not just being outside that does our brains a favor, it's also unplugging, limiting added stimulation and responding instead to our natural surroundings. Asking students about studying in a busy coffee shop versus taking an exam there drives home the point that we think more clearly when we have fewer distractions. And I love the story about the professor who said, "Look at everyone so uncomfortable with their own thoughts." The French philosopher and mathematician Blaise Pascal, who died in 1662, centuries before the cell phone, said, quote, "All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone." Now, back to our conversation. You mentioned depression. ADHD, I think, has also been looked at through this lens. And I'm sure when people are listening, some people listening are saying, well, this is all well and good, but I live in the heart of a downtown. I don't have access to nature the way a lot of people do. And you have made some really strong points about how this should influence our urban planning, how we think about where we might want to choose to live if we have the luxury of a choice. Can you talk about that and the 11 trees data that you talk about? I found that really interesting because I don't think it's often part of why we think about green spaces in urban planning or where we choose to live.
Yeah. There's a lot to unpack there. So I guess I'll start with the 11 trees. So in addition to mental health and psychological well-being, we also think a lot about physical health. And again, at the very beginning of the podcast, Bill, we talked about mind and body not being separate, that they're integrated. And, we also find, and other people find, that being near nature, living near nature, interacting with nature more is also good for physical health. And so there's a number of studies. So I'll tell you one of the studies we did and then some other studies that other people did that I think are really, really interesting. So we had a data set in Toronto, in Ontario, Canada, that was a really, really cool data set. Basically, we had satellite imagery of all the different neighborhoods in Toronto. We could quantify how much green space or how much tree canopy there was in all these different neighborhoods in Toronto. But we also had this other data set for Toronto where the Toronto Forestry Department cataloged every single tree on public land in the city of Toronto. So they had data from 580,000 trees in the city of Toronto. And these are mostly trees on the easements. So that's the land in between the sidewalk and the street. We knew the species of the tree and the diameter of the tree at breast height, basically how old the tree is. And from that, one of my students, Omid Kardan, he could quantify how much tree canopy each of those individual trees provided. And from those data, we could separate the trees on public land from the trees on private land. And then we also had health data from about 32,000 people in Toronto, asking them things like, how healthy do you feel? But also asking them more objective questions about their health, such as, did you ever have a stroke? Do you have diabetes? Do you have heart disease? And so basically we wanted to see, okay, is there some kind of relationship between the amount of tree canopy in your neighborhood, in particular the trees on the public land, and the health of people living in that neighborhood, controlling for obvious confounding variables like the age of the people, how educated they were, how wealthy they were, how wealthy the neighborhood was. So the first thing we did is just say, okay, is there some relationship between the trees and how healthy you feel? And we did find, yes, that actually having 10 trees of average size was related to a 1% increase in people's health perception. Now, that might sound pretty modest, but to get that equivalent 1% increase in health perception, you had to give every household about $10,000, have them all move to a neighborhood that had a median income that was about $10,000 wealthier, or make people 7 years younger. So pretty hard to make people feel healthier. But maybe even more interesting was looking at objective measures of health. So what we called cardiometabolic disorders. So this is stroke, diabetes, heart disease. It turns out that having 11 more trees of average size on your city block was related to a 1% reduction in these cardiometabolic disorders. Again, that sounds pretty modest, but to get that equivalent decrease monetarily, you'd have to give every household in that neighborhood about $20,000, have them all move to a neighborhood where the median income was $20,000 wealthier, or make people about 1.5 years younger. So again, the trees were having this significant effect on health, controlling for these obvious confounding variables of age, education, and income. And I think there's a couple important things to mention here too. One is that it was good that these studies were done in Ontario, Canada, because people have socialized medicine there. So basically everybody's getting more or less the same healthcare. So healthcare is not varying by economics, which is good. And people might also be saying, okay, but Mark, this isn't causal, and it's correlational. I can't claim causality. The bad case scenario is that just healthier people choose to live in neighborhoods that have more trees. That could be true, but because we're controlling for age, education, income, those people that are healthier can't be wealthier, they can't be younger, they can't be more educated. So I think there's some, I'm pretty confident sort of implying the direction of causality, but I can't claim strong causality. The study where we can claim stronger causality was this really interesting study that was done in the Midwest that had to do with this pesky invasive beetle called the emerald ash borer beetle. The emerald ash borer beetle killed millions of ash trees in the Midwest, just decimated ash trees. And so what researchers did was they looked at health before the emerald ash borer bug killed all these ash trees and afterwards. And what they found was that there was about, when the emerald ash borer bug killed, these 10 million trees in the Midwest, there was a spike in mortality by about 28,000 more deaths. Again, due to cardiovascular diseases. And that's sort of a natural experiment. Ethically, I can't cut down trees in different neighborhoods and see how that's going to affect health. But here it was a natural experiment. Okay, we have health before this invasive beetle and then afterwards. And it did seem to be the case that when these trees died, it affected mortality. And that there was this provocative kind of title or meme that basically when trees die, people die. And I think that makes sense from many, many different perspectives. So you might be asking yourself, why are there these health benefits? One could be having to do with air quality, that the trees are good for air quality. Another thing is that people think that trees are sort of an aesthetic. It's nice out. It might encourage people to be outside more, to walk more, to exercise more. But it could also have to do with the aesthetic of nature, the patterns of nature, and seeing nature that could have these benefits. And there's a study by Roger Ulrich that suggests that it could be this aesthetic property. So Roger did this incredible study in the 80s in a hospital in Philadelphia. So he looked at a single hospital corridor in Philadelphia. Some of these hospital rooms on the corridor had a view of modest nature, like some trees, some grass, some bushes. Other windows out of this hospital corridor had a view of like a brick wall, like the hospital turning back onto itself. And what Roger was interested in looking at was recovery from gallbladder surgery. And what he found is that patients that had the views of nature recovered from gallbladder surgery a day earlier, and they used less pain medications than the people that had the views of the brick wall. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, maybe wealthier people, younger people, more educated people get the nature views. No, the patients are just randomly assigned to whatever room is available, and this had a significant impact on their health. And people might say, well, gallbladder surgery now is outpatient, but back then it wasn't. So, and there you think, well, what's going on there? I don't think that's air quality. I don't think that's exercise. There's something about seeing nature or hearing nature, these natural patterns, that when our brain processes those patterns, it could have some healing properties. And I know that might sound a little bit kind of woo-woo, but there might be truth to that.
No, I was going to bring up the hospital if you didn't, because I had done some volunteer work, mostly in the state of Maine, where there's so much incredible nature. And these were not woo-woo professionals, and they were all about, when we were doing remodeling and things, floor-to-ceiling windows whenever possible, views. And if you can't have a view, or even with a small view, adding art that reflects nature. Not a Mona Lisa, but a picture of the Portland Headlight Lighthouse and the ocean and all these things. And they swore by it. And they were probably referring to some of the research you just cited, but there's a strong movement that makes a huge difference. And frankly, it's also, I think, one of the reasons people heal better in an outpatient setting. Just getting outside, being able to look out the window in your home, as opposed to the beeps and the buzzes and the sterile environment of a hospital.
Yeah, absolutely.
I always enjoy learning about how research is conducted, and particularly appreciated Marc's explanation of the 11 Trees study. In true optimistic fashion, Marc spreads the word of these findings, partly in hopes that they might influence our choice of where we live and also how we plan our urban environments. As we try to build housing that's affordable in cities that are growing more crowded, it seems we do us all a big favor if we incorporate as much nature as possible, even if it's just a few dozen trees. Now back to the final segment of my Blue Sky conversation with Nature and the Mind author, Marc Berman. So if someone's listening to this right now and you had to give just a handful of recommendations, and people might be wondering what this has to do with optimism, it's my belief that if you're not exhausted by all these other distractions and these sorts of things, this frees your energy up, your mindset up to feel better about the world and our future than if you're huddled over a screen. And I'll talk more about that when we introduce this episode. But what's a small handful of pieces of advice that you could give to our audience if they want to sort of live out and embody what you've studied in your work?
Yeah, and I think too, maybe I'll just go back to the optimism point, which is that, I would say that optimism might require cognitive resources. That it's much easier to be pessimistic, and when I talk about directed attention, I think a lot of people think about kids squirming in their chairs or not being able to concentrate at work, but we think directed attention is more important than that. That when your directed attention is fatigued, you're not as goal directed. You may be more impatient and irritable. You may become more aggressive. And we think you need to have this bank of directed attention to kind of achieve human flourishing. And in other work, we've shown we actually monitor what people think about when they're in a more natural environment versus a more urban environment. And we find that when people are in a more natural environment, their thoughts are more positive, so more optimistic. They think less about themselves, more about others. They think more about the past than the present and the future. They're less impulsive, so they're just more reflective. So there's all these benefits on thoughts, what you're thinking about when you're in nature. And we've actually even found that, being in more natural environments makes people feel more spiritual and think more about their life journey. And even looking at pictures of nature can do that. Or Jackson Pollock like paintings that mimic the patterns of nature can cause that. So I do think that a lot of this work has a lot to do with optimism, and other researchers have found, for example, that interacting with nature can cause people to humanize others more. So you hear so much about dehumanization, but people have found that interacting with nature, or even having plants indoors, can cause people to humanize others more, to think of others as being more human. And you can imagine that would have a lot of other benefits. So certainly I think this is related to optimism. And so for advice that I would give people, I think, there's different levels of advice. So I think the first thing is directed attention is really, really important. And you should treat it as a precious resource and not just give it away. What that also means is that you need to be mindful of your directed attention. So if you're working and you've hit a wall and you can't concentrate and you feel like you're getting irritable, and don't just power through. Okay. Don't just power through. Don't reach for the phone. Don't scroll. Try and go and interact with nature. Okay. If there is no nature nearby and you can't interact with nature, can you look at a window to nature? If you can't look at a window to nature, we find that viewing pictures of nature or listening to nature sounds can have some of these same benefits. It's not as strong of an effect, but you can get some of these benefits with the simulations of nature. Maybe you can bring plants into your indoor environment. They can be fake plants. So mimicking the patterns of nature can also have some of these impacts. Okay, if you are fortunate enough to be able to go and interact with real nature, it's kind of recommended that you try to get 2 hours a week of interaction time with nature. And I would recommend that you do it when you feel most mentally fatigued. So if you're a morning person and you get up and you're ready to go, don't go for the nature walk then. Go for the nature walk when you're more mentally fatigued. If you're not a morning person, it really takes you a while to get going. Maybe you want to go for the nature walk in the morning. That's something to kind of play with a little bit. Don't have the earbuds in. Don't have your phone. Leave that at home. Go by yourself. Don't go with somebody else. I like to try to get my kids out in nature. It's not always easy. When I get my kids out in nature, that doesn't count as my nature time. That's their nature time.
I get it.
That's their nature time. It's not necessarily restful for me.
No.
I think walking the dog is good. The dog is not too demanding of directed attention. Then I think we get into these, these are all things you can do as an individual. But then I think, I write about in the book about trying to start a nature revolution. And I think that involves treating this work as not being an amenity, but being a necessity. So often people say, oh, it'd be nice to have nature, but we don't really need it. Or it'd be nice to have nature, but we got to spend money on something else. And I think what my research and other people's research is saying is that, no, this is not an amenity. This is a necessity. This is something we have to have, which means we have to bring it into our schools. We have to bring it into our homes. We have to bring it into our offices. We have to bring it into our cities. And I don't want people to think that I'm anti-city. I think cities are very, very positive. And I have other research showing that more populated, bigger cities have lower depression rates per capita, lower implicit racial biases. So cities are really, really good. but we want to naturize them. We want to get more nature into them. And I talked about this in the book too. Central Park is this incredible park in Manhattan. We want to have more Central Park, and Chicago has 3 huge parks that together they're contiguous. Together they're bigger than Central Park, also designed by the same landscape architect, Frederick Law Olmsted. Jackson Park, the Midway Plaisance, and Washington Park. Fabulous parks. But the problem is they're right next to heavily trafficked roads, and that sound just doesn't make the natural experience as beneficial. And there was one time I was in Jackson Park with my kids in the Circle Garden in Jackson Park, and literally a hubcap from a car flew off and rolled around in front of us. It was like a cartoon. And I'm just thinking, this is such a crime. This is such a great park, and we're wrecking it. So that it's not just enough to put a park. You have to protect the park. People have to feel safe in the park. It's got to be well maintained, well lit. So, these are all things that are going to cost money, but I think it could be, short-term pain for long-term gain. Think of it as an investment that might have real productivity benefits.
And one of the reasons I believe Central Park is as great as it is now is they removed cars from the major thoroughfares there. You can cut through the park, but the roads that go around the park are now closed to traffic, and it really changed everything. Marc, I loved your book. I think you are onto something really important, and I'm glad you mentioned Jonathan Haidt too, because I feel like these things can all come together in ways that are going to be really good for our well-being, mental, physical, all together. And so the more we can raise up your work along with Jonathan Haidt's, I feel a momentum building. I'm an optimist, but I think it's really happening. And so I really appreciate your work.
Thanks so much, Bill. And yeah, I agree. I think this is very complimentary to Jonathan's work. Jonathan's saying, get off of the devices, get off of social media. And I'm saying, and instead of that, do this, get some more interaction with nature. So yeah, and I think that's also kind of part of this nature revolution and trying to make things a little bit easier. If it's hard to interact with nature, people aren't going to do it. I have a colleague, Richard Thaler, the Nobel Prize economist. He said, if you want to get people to do something, make it easy. And currently in society, we haven't made it easy to interact with nature, and I think that's something that we need to kind of really think seriously about.
Totally agree. Marc Berman, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciated this conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bill. I really enjoyed it.
I loved hearing Marc observe that optimism requires cognitive resources. It's easier to be pessimistic. I couldn't agree more. And all we need, he says, is 2 hours a week in nature. And the best time is when we're most fatigued. I happen to be a morning person, so for me, that's later in the day, and I fully intend to put Marc's advice to work. And I'm all in on this notion that he'd like to start a nature revolution, emphasizing that wherever we live, nature should be seen not as an amenity, but as a necessity. I hope you enjoyed this Blue Sky conversation with Dr. Marc Berman. Before you go, please leave us a rating or review. These help us keep making our shows better and also make it easier for others to find us. While you're at it, you might want to subscribe to Blue Sky wherever you get your podcasts. Sign up for the Blue Sky Weekend newsletter at theoptimisminstitute.com and follow us on social media. This and all Blue Sky episodes are made possible by the incredible editing and mixing done by the team at Sound On, Sound Off. You can learn more about their work at soundonsoundoff.com. All graphic design and cover art for Blue Sky and the Optimism Institute are provided by Crush Graphics. That's Crush with a K, if you'd like to check out more of their fantastic work at crushgraphics.com. Until next time, I'm the founder of the Optimism Institute and host of Blue Sky, Bill Burke. I thank you for listening.